John Adams, one of our founding fathers and second president of the United States, went from being a principled young lawyer who was willing to take the unpopular but just position of defending British soldiers who were accused of killing 5 colonists. However, by the time he was in the White House, he was a politician who was willing to use the power of the government to punish his political enemies under the guise of a foreign war. Before becoming president and before becoming a representative in the Continental Congress, he was a lawyer living and working in Boston with his wife and a growing family. Following the French and Indian War, the relationship between Great Britain and the colonies grew increasingly contentious. There were a series of taxations levied upon them, and the troops were permanently stationed in the colonies. And on March 5th, 1770, the inevitable happened. A group of British soldiers fired their weapons at a crowd of colonists, killing 5 and injuring others. And the colonists of Boston, especially Sam Adams, who was John's cousin and leader of the patriot group, the Sons of Liberty, were in no mood for an impartial judgment of the facts. So what did John Adams do? He took up the case and he defended the soldiers because it was the right thing to do. And as it turns out, the events of that night, of what became known as the Boston Massacre, were not clear-cut. There was a lot going on. A mob of about 60 angry townspeople had descended upon the guards at the custom house. And when reinforcements were called in, the crowd became more and more unruly. They started hurling not just taunts, but ice and snow, rocks, oyster shells, broken glass. And in the heat of the confusing scene, the British fired on the crowd and took the lives of 5 men and injured others. Although the soldiers claimed to have acted in self-defense, Patriot propaganda referred to the incident as the Boston Massacre. 8 British soldiers and their officer in charge, Captain Thomas Preston, faced charges for murdering 5 colonists. However, thanks to John Adams' unyielding pursuit for the truth, Captain Preston and 4 of his men were cleared of all charges. 2 others were convicted of manslaughter, but were sentenced to a branding of the thumb rather than hanging, which would have been the sentence if they were found guilty of murder. I recount this episode of American history because it not just lays the groundwork for some very important legal precedents, but because it establishes one of the most foundational elements of American society. The truth is more important than what is popular. And even though the outcome wasn't popular, because Adams had conducted himself professionally and honestly, the Bostonians accepted that unpopular decision. And not only that, but Adams was revered as a lawyer, and ultimately, it positioned him to become a representative in the Continental Congress, and then go on to be the vice president and president of the United States. However, that's not where Adams' story ends. Unfortunately, as he moved on in his political career, his objectivity and impartiality faded away, and he became more embroiled in the party politics of the day. The election of 1796 was the first American election that saw 2 organized political parties wrestle for power at the ballot box. John Adams emerged as president, with Thomas Jefferson as the runner-up. I covered the complete history of this election in my video, The History of Party Politics. So go check that one out after this video for the full history. But for the purposes here today, just know that during Washington's tenure as president, the once united founding fathers splintered into political factions. Adams was associated with the Federalists, which also had a more extreme faction known as the Ultra or High Federalists. And on the other side were the Republicans, led by Jefferson, dealing with issues domestically and abroad, as well as political jockeying within the White House and Congress. Adams' once principled stance on the truth faded away. The radical factions of the Federalist Party pressed to pass the Alien and Seditions Act. The Alien Act allowed for the federal government to deport any immigrant who was deemed a threat to peace or the government. The Sedition Acts stipulated that any individual criticizing the government, including the president, could be arrested. Adams signed the legislation, and later poorly defended his reservations, saying it was a wartime measure. Sounds familiar, huh? The Republicans, led by Jefferson, argued this was not about protecting the country, this was about protecting the Adams administration. He argued that it was a violation of not just the First Amendment by stifling legitimate criticism of the government and shutting down freedom of speech, but it also violated the Ninth and 10th Amendments. The fierce Republican opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts likely contributed to Jefferson's victory in the presidential election of 1800. And once in office, Jefferson pardoned those convicted under the Sedition Act, which had expired on the last day of Adams' term. However, as president, Jefferson himself went after rival Federalist editors. This controversy reveals that even the founders themselves would violate the First Amendment and other laws of the land for political purposes. The Jeffersonian Republicans believed the Federalists were monarchists and they had to be stopped at all costs, whereas the Federalists believed the Republicans were anarchists and had to be stopped at all costs. Today, instead of Federalists and Republicans, we have the woke and the anti-woke, entrenched ideologies eager to weaponize the power of the government against one another, using the justification that it must be done to save the country.
Come on.